Welcome to the Disability And podcast. This month, Dr. Alison Wilde, an assistant professor of social sciences at Northumbria University, chats with Dr. Ella Houston, a senior lecturer in disability studies at Liverpool Hope University, about her book, Advertising Disability, and how pro-diversity advertising further stigmatises disabled people.
Hi Ella, it's really nice to see you here today, and congratulations on your new book. In particular, Dr. Ella Houston works as a senior lecturer at Liverpool Hope University, specialising in advertising and disability studies and teaching a lot of students across a range of disability studies topics. But I'll leave more introduction of herself to Ella. So thanks for coming today. It's really nice to see you. And I'd like to talk to you about your book and other related research. So first of all then, could you tell us a bit more about yourself that I might have missed? And could you then tell us a little bit about your new book?
Definitely. And thank you. It's a great privilege to be interviewed by you, Alison. Advertising disability is situated in cultural disability studies in particular. And this is very much aligned with my work. As you mentioned, I'm a senior lecturer in disability studies at Liverpool Hope University. And I'm also a core member of the Research Centre for Culture and Disability Studies, which is led by Professor David Bulk and located at Hope University. So my interests really are in cultural attitude and cultural responses to disability. Now, one thing that I've noticed over the years is that advertising does not get as much attention in cultural disability studies in comparison to television, film, literary texts, and so on. And advertising disability really tries to tackle this issue because I would argue, and other scholars, for example, Professor Beck-Haller, prominently have argued that, advertising is all around us. We can't escape the clutches of advertising if we're scrolling social media, if we're going shopping, if we're watching television and so on, if we're listening to the radio. So advertising disability really thinks about the impact over decades and, in fact, centuries that advertisements, representations of disability in advertisements have had on public attitudes towards disabled people, and also how representations of disability in advertisements have impacted disabled people on more micro levels. So, for example, I draw on the concept of psycho-emotional disablism, drawing on the great Professor Carol Thomas, who was actually my PhD supervisor at Lancaster University, on her concept of psycho-emotional disablism. I really believe that due to the pervasive presence of advertising in society, that these portrayals can have profound influences on how disabled people feel about themselves and how they believe they're viewed and treated by other people in society.
Yeah. I completely agree with you. And I was so pleased when I learned quite a few years ago that you were studying on this topic. Up until then, I think, and you might be able to put me right, I think there was very, very little work. And I remember reading and being quite horrified about a chapter in Visual Culture by Jessica Evans on charity advertising and disabled people. As much as I like her work, I felt from that stage that, there clearly needed to be disability or critical disability studies ethos injected into that, because otherwise we get this individualistic kind of perspective, which, again, as you just said, leaves us out. One thing that I'm really delighted about with your book is that you've got the voices of disabled people in it, and disabled women in particular. So I wondered if you could say a little bit more about why you decided to do audience research and how that worked out, and what you think of the place of audience research within that topic. How important is it?
So for my PhD research, my topic focused on disabled women's responses to representations of disability and gender in different types of advertisements. So this is from charity advertisements to pharmaceutical advertisements, fashion and beauty advertising. And one thing I was fascinated by is the diversity of participant responses to these advertisements. So, for example, I remember interviewing a group of women individually about representations of women with visual impairments in charity advertising. In particular, we talked about an advertisement produced by Guide Dogs for the Blind Association. And, in this advertisement, it focuses on a woman who identifies as blind, her guide dog Jazz, and her small children. And the ad is very much that Jazz has, changed her life and that they can do these things as a family now. Her little boy says Jazz helps mum be mum. Now, some of the women that I interviewed were repulsed by this advertisement. They said, first of all, it's this idea that, a guide dog will help me fulfill motherly duties first and foremost, that that's the most important thing in my life. Some found it very patronizing, whereas others, would say things like, first of all, oh, look, cute puppies, this is a really nice advert. Or, I remember one woman saying to me, she really liked that quote from the boy, that Jazz helps mum be mum, because to her, that resembles how something like a guide dog or, some sort of accessibility aid, something as simple as that can provide quite a big difference. So that really got me fascinated by audience responses and how often the advertising industry will put out articles or have debates about how do disabled people want to be represented. Like disabled people are a homogenous identity group who want the same thing. And actually, it's so diverse. So honestly, I think on a very simple level, I'm very interested in the diversity of disabled people's responses to advertisements. And I've always been fascinated by people's narratives, personal narratives as well. And I find that, for example, in research interviews with disabled participants, representations of disability in advertisements can act as a fascinating prompt for discussion. Even a very abstract advertisement with just an image, no caption or no tagline, can prompt a lot of discussion, reflection on identity and personal stories. And one other thing that I should mention is that the book is part of the Autocritical Disability Studies book series, which is led by Professor David Bolt, who I mentioned previously. And this book series, which has got a great selection of books in, so includes books by my colleagues, Professor David Bolt, Dr. Erin Pritchard at Liverpool Hope University. And the book, has a profound interest in disabled people's experiences and how they inform disability studies inquiry from start to finish. So I was really pleased that advertising disability fits in very well with the remit of that book series.
Absolutely. And I think it's an exciting new development in that ever-growing kind of range of disability perspectives. So yeah, I'm following that with great interest. So thank you. That's a really comprehensive answer to my question. I've got another question about the book. I like the fact that there's some historical tracing in the book. And I'm particularly struck with that word sadvertisement. And so, this idea of sadvertisements from the 18th century and everything. So I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about your opinions on how much the idea of the sadvertisement has changed. And I'm thinking, for example, given this isn't my area of study at all, when I think of recent what might be called progressive images of disabled women on advertisements, my mind immediately goes to the Maltesers ad, for example, and this kind of almost naughty image of disabled women. So could you tell us something about what you think the progress from sadvertisements has been?
In the book, I think about advertising and disability from the 18th century onwards. The very first starting point was the complete absence of disabled people from advertising. And you might think, oh, well, what have you got to say about that, seeing as though there were no images to speak about? Well, I think that speaks volumes in and of itself. Advertising during the period of the Industrial Revolution in particular really started to be a tool in society to sell images of success, very capitalist images of success. People, moving to towns from rural areas, suddenly, living in very densely populated areas, became increasingly self-conscious about the image that they were putting forward. And the idea that was sold is that image and first impressions are key to social and success in work spheres as well. So the fact that disabled people were completely omitted from these images of success and beauty and social cohesion in advertising speaks volumes about how they were, beginning to be isolated, pushed to the margins in society. So then we think about how disabled people started to appear in advertising and, this idea, this concept of sadvertising. Unfortunately, I can't say that I coined that term. So that term was already used, but I think it really captures the, pity fest advertising that we so hate in disability studies and that have, really been fought against by the disabled people's movement for decades. So sadvertising, I would say up until the 1980s, disabled people were solely portrayed in charity advertisements. When you get to the 1980s, disabled people started to appear in mainstream adverts for companies like Levi's, McDonald's, and so on, Budweiser as well. When I was researching for the book, I read a really interesting article that was talking about, not explicitly about disability, but about charity advertising in general, about how audiences are now moving towards wanting to see happy victims, in quotes, in advertisements. So, people, the charity advertising industry is increasingly aware now that a lot of people experience compassion fatigue. And so when you have the traditional advertising where it's all doom and gloom, can you help this person? £1 a week can make their life less awful. This is what they're going through. For a lot of people, that doesn't really work anymore. One, because people are increasingly skeptical of charities and what they spend their money on, but also because these images of sadness are just so far removed from their own lives that they kind of switch off. Portrayals of disability in charity ads have been heavily criticised for very good reasons for many years. Now the tide is changing, where you will often see now in advertisements, narratives like, oh, look at this disabled person living a great life. This is thanks to charity intervention. So you will see much more superficially positive images of disabled people in charity adverts. However, I still have, a lot to say about these type of advertisements in the book. I think they continue to be, in the majority of instances, very patronizing because they suggest that disabled people are living good lives because of charity intervention. They often promote very cliched messages, undermine disability activism, and also, can give a false sense of reassurance that now, well, disabled people have never had it better. Look at this person, they're living their best life, so we don't need to campaign for disabled people's rights anymore.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually. And I mean, there were so many questions coming from what you said. And yeah, I can think of exceptions to that. And you're right. You don't want to completely say, well, it's fine. So why are you even advertising for it? But first of all, the exceptions. I've noticed recently that I think there's dementia ads which are really, really depressing. And of course, coping with dementia for anybody is not easy. But that seems to be an exception, and I think MND as well. And those are often feature men as well. But what do you think about these exceptions then?
It really is a tricky debate to be had about charity advertising because, I mean, in the book, a key concept I work with is, it was introduced by Professor David Mitchell and Dr. Sharon Snyder, neoliberal inclusionism. This idea that, in recent years, particularly in very neoliberal societies, on the surface, it does seem as though disabled people are living great lives. And especially capitalist industries, advertising, commercial companies, educational institutions, workplaces continue to pump out these ideas that, we really care about diversity and we care about promoting diversity. So on the surface of things in advertisements, it really does seem that diversity is being promoted. Now, in charity advertisements, the thing is, in neoliberal societies, charities are a necessity because while the state isn't providing support for disabled people, charities act as a crutch to provide support where the state won't. And so a lot of charities, I do believe have, good intentions or good aspirations, want to help people. And so they are very much driven by wanting to generate dramatic responses from audiences. So they will inevitably promote the more dramatized narratives. You mentioned the dementia advertisements, because in order to reach audiences, grab their attention, they believe that's what they need to do. However, a key point I make throughout the book is that often these narratives of disability, and I draw on Professor David Bolt's work about meta-narratives, tragedy-ridden meta-narratives of disability, how they really clash and undermine. They are not in sync in any way with activist counter-narratives generated by disabled people and the disabled people's movement.
One thing that you've been referring to is what you've called in one of your articles the commodification of disability. Is there any more that you'd like to say about that particular piece of work on the commodification of disability?
Mm, the commodification of disability, yeah, I think it's an interesting one and it's multi-layered. I mean, one of the points, the key arguments I make in the conclusion of the book is that there really is, in terms of disability and advertising and the commodification of disability and diversity, so there also really is a hierarchy of disability that's going on here. And I'm not the first one to kind of make this point that, I know, for example, Beth Haller's work has highlighted this, that in advertising for years now, we've had, a growing presence of disability. However, it tends to be confined to portrayals of people with mobility impairments and sensory impairments. And it's been argued that this is the case because if somebody has mobility impairments or sensory impairments, then you can have very obvious visual signifiers of disability, such as a white cane, for example, to signify that someone has visual impairments, or a wheelchair to signify that someone has mobility impairments. So there is a very selective commodification of disability. In the conclusion, I point out that in, say, these fashion and beauty advertisements that make us think that these companies are, paragons of inclusion, really championing disabled people. And, nowhere to be seen are images of people with learning disabilities, apart from maybe the cutesy images as children with learning disabilities or, say, Down syndrome, for some fashion companies, people with dwarfism, people who experience mental health issues, people who have chronic illnesses, and so on. So that really ties into the notion of neoliberal inclusionism as well, the selective approach that's taken. We can never get away from the fact that the key fundamental purpose of advertising is to raise awareness of brands and is to promote profits for brands. So I suppose you can never get away from that commodification of disability.
I don't know if you agree, but I think there's a bit of paradox there, both for your work and for my work in different areas of media, but in the kind of drive within the disability movement itself, is that we do want recognition and we do want to be represented, but we're living in a capitalist society and it almost seems that we can't avoid that commodification of disability. What do you think of that? Can we achieve these goals without commodification?
I don't think so. No, sadly, I think it would be unrealistic if I said that we can. Although, I mean, a point I should raise is that I don't want it to come across as though I'm solely pessimistic about advertising. Actually, I hope anyone who reads the book would very much appreciate that in many ways I'm quite optimistic about advertising and disability. And I think one of the key things is because advertisers do want to appeal to many different types of people, the idea of it makes monetary sense for a brand and advertising agency to make one advertisement that appeals not just to a very select small audience, but to many different types of people. So I actually think that the aims of advertising, reaching as many people as possible, reaching new audiences, which of course is tied into commodification, actually can be a real push and nudge for advertisers to improve how they represent disabled people. And across the years, Paul Longmore has pointed out, years ago, that advertisers have been ahead of the curve in terms of the media industries in representing disabled people. So for example, in the 1980s, there was a Budweiser's advertisement of a guy who uses a wheelchair, very kind of attractive and fit, as models always are in alcohol advertisements. And he's like pumping weights and his girlfriend is watching him. Then he hops in his wheelchair and they go off together. This is in the 1980s. So advertisers really have been quite cool in many ways in how they've represented disability.
Yeah, it's a good point. And I think one thing is, ostensibly, it's a lot harder to avoid stereotypes because of the shortness of advertisements. In fact, not all of them are even have any length if they're just like visual representations. So in a way, that's even a harder task than, say, doing it in a soap opera, I think. So yeah, lots of food for thought there, I think. By the way, I love the fact, I think you're a little bit modest, but I love the fact that you're continually referencing where you've got your ideas from. And I think we need a lot more of that, both in academia and in the movement, actually. One thing I wanted to ask you about then, and I'm really glad that you see how the kind of the progress that's been made and the importance for it to advertisers. I know that alongside students, disabled people, that your book is also aimed at people in the advertising industry. How do you think they could use your book to improve even further?
My dream, like my ultimate goal, would be that if people in the advertising industry like read the book, and I'm not deluded. I don't think many people in the industry would sit down to read the book in full. But especially if I was talking to people about the book in the advertising industry, one of the key messages that I want to put across is that it's the complexity, to appreciate the complexity. And sometimes it feels like a losing battle because a lot of the time when I talk about my work to people in the industry, one of the first questions will be, well, how do disabled people want to be represented? And, this is what I write about in the conclusion, because so often in academia as well, one of the top pieces of advice for writing a conclusion is recommendations for future practice, what we should do differently. But as you will know, Alison, due to your work as well and, audience responses, very, very difficult to give recommendations for representations because of the diversity of audience responses. So I think a key thing would be appreciating that there is no kind of tried and tested formula for representing disabled people. I mean, an obvious one, but it's not so obvious because it's very slow to kind of happen, is that the advertising industry needs to employ more disabled people. I mean, inclusion is only inclusion in name alone if it's only down to representation. Talking about referencing other people's work, actually, Professor David Bolt has written about this in terms of, ableist advertising, how, advertisers will gain a lot of kudos and brands will gain a lot of kudos for including disabled people in advertisements. But then it's really problematic and very tokenistic if those advertisements have only been designed by non-disabled people, the recipe for disaster. But also, representation in name only occurs when you have advertisements that feature disabled people, but they don't have any accessibility thought for accessibility, closed captions, for example, or, David Bolton in his work has talked about dove advertising. in particular, an advertisement that featured a woman with visual impairments, and she's getting ready to go out with her friends, which is, progressive, great. But at no point is there a voiceover naming what the product, advertised is. And so it's inaccessible to people with visual impairments, yet it's representing someone with visual impairments.
So in the production of that, you're talking about basically 360, and you're talking about, for example, having disabled people involved in the writing and design of the advert in the first place as well, because that's often missed out, isn't it? That huge focus on who's being represented on the screen, for example.
I go beyond that as well, because my fear is that when I make recommendations like this, sometimes advertising agencies will then, have they might have an employee, who is disabled, and they then become the disability champion, and it's kind of like they are the person then responsible, the token disabled person involved in the production of advertisements. I would also say I really think that the advertising industry needs to pay a lot more heed to the disabled people's movement. The advertising industry has often tried to say mimic or speak the language of women's liberation and Black Lives Matter, and sometimes that can be quite insulting when it's done in tokenistic ways. However, when it comes to disability, there hardly seems to be any recognition whatsoever of disability activism or the disabled people's movement, and I think that's really poor.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. Even in those occasions where they have disability programs on, you might expect a bit of deliberate kind of advertising amongst those. So that brings me to another question, which is about the impact of streaming. Personally speaking, as and where I often watch things not when they're on, but later, as many of us do, and we try to do it in a way that gets rid of the adverts. So, how do you think this has changed things for us in the value of using adverts, and the way that disability and impairment is represented on them? Has it changed things? If so, how?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. And I must admit, I think most of us would say that if we're watching a film or a TV program and the advertising break comes on, we kind of want to fast forward to watch the rest of the film or the TV program. I often feel a little bit guilty. I feel like I should always watch advertising breaks, like it's field work for me. So I definitely think, streaming and being able to go past advertising breaks, I would imagine poses an issue for the advertising industry more broadly, not least for, representations of disabled people, and how perhaps the power of TV advertising, representations of disabled people in TV advertising are losing their sway a bit because of streaming. However, with streaming, I think that, social media advertising and online advertising is exponentially growing. And this is something that I really focus on in chapter 6 of the book. So disabled social media influencers, and it's an area of advertising which is really exciting actually, and it is growing at a great speed. I think about disabled social media influencers and, how this presents an opportunity for disabled people to have more control than they've ever had before in how they're represented in advertising. Because the key thing is social media influencer advertising really depends on this notion of authenticity. The idea is that social media influencers are the new generation of celebrities, and that, in advertising, they play a really important role because people are getting increasingly wary of advertising pictures. So the idea that you follow or you're a particular fan of an influencer, and then, you're, say, on TikTok or Instagram, and their posts happen to be sponsored by a brand, they're working in partnership with an advertising agency, people can trust those kind of sales pictures a lot more. And, one of those advertisements are particularly powerful because they work on that person's likability. So often you'll find in these advertisements, rather than talking at length about the product or about the brand, actually, the social media influencer will tell you a story about their life or a day in the life of, or let us talk about this topic, and they'll make brief references to the product. So I think that this presents a lot of opportunities for disabled people to at the same time as that they're working with a brand, so they've got a platform in that sense, but they're also sharing first person accounts of disability while doing so. I mean, the caveat is, of course, there's always a caveat that these advertisements, these posts that are, part of paid sponsorship deals, of course, they often are edited. I'm not naive. I know that, social media influencers will have to say certain things that make them more marketable, that there might be quite a lot of influence from the brand or advertising agency. However, I do think they present quite exciting opportunities as well.
Very briefly, is there a platform that dominates then that's particularly good for advertising via social media? And Instagram perhaps, or TikTok?
Well, I mean, I don't use Instagram, but I do use TikTok. So I suppose I would go more towards TikTok. I think TikTok is very interesting as well because in terms of advertisements are short and sweet, and obviously TikTok videos tend to be quite brief. And some people say, well, in these brief, in 30 seconds, how on earth can you get across complex messages about disability? And that's a fair point because, before I've mentioned the importance of complexity. However, I think that in, say, short TikTok videos, in short social media advertisements, you can get across quite powerful messages of disability that are entertaining, but will also stick in people's minds. And another thing that I like about things like TikTok is that it's very easy for people, say when they're making an advertisement or a TikTok video, to add accessibility features that just close captions. And I noticed that quite a lot of content creators do this, and maybe they're not necessarily thinking about accessibility, they're just doing it because it's a cool feature on the app, but it, promotes accessibility.
I particularly love your paper on the pharmaceutical industry and NS. So I wondered if you'd like to tell us a little bit about that paper before we close with some final comments. One thing, which theory often talks about is with the social model where things around very important concerns for a lot of us around medication and things, and around all the kind of social relationships around that, how that affects us as disabled people. So if you can say more about MS and the pharmaceutical industry, that would be really useful, I think.
Yeah, no, thank you, Alison. I really enjoyed writing the paper about, portrayals of multiple sclerosis in direct consumer pharmaceutical advertisements. I found it fascinating because, as you mentioned previously, portrayals of NS in charity advertisements, in pharmaceutical advertisements, the history is absolutely dire because the key message that was put across, and to be honest with you, this message is still promoted by, the MS Society, for example, in some of its charity advertisements. I saw one that was released in recent years. I think it was, I can't remember if it was the MS Society of New Zealand or America, but the image was of a person who was meant to be a hunter because they had like a long shotgun in their hand, and their head was replaced by I think, a stag. So it's this idea that, your body is literally turning on itself. So diabolical images of MS in charity advertisements and pharmaceutical advertisements. So when I set out to analyze very recent representations of MS in American pharmaceutical advertisements, I was expecting quite a bleak picture. However, what I found is that these images on the surface were incredibly positive. You would have so there were images mostly of young people with MS, and apart from it's a small sample of advertisements that I analysed, but there was only one advertisement which had a visual symbol of MS, a young woman using a mobility cane. And of course, I'm aware that there aren't always visual symbols of MS, but I did find it interesting that there was only one slight symbol. But basically the theme across the advertisements is that there are now drug therapies that people can take, once a day or even once every couple of months, and get along with their lives and live happy, fulfilling lives. So that message seems really great and very different to previous messages. However, there is this implicit message, very subtle message, that MS is kind of a hidden enemy. That MS is the underlying threat to the happy, fulfilling lives, and that thanks to drug therapies, thanks to supposedly altruistic pharmaceutical companies, you can, with pharmaceutical intervention, keep that hidden enemy at bay. So I think that's really interesting. In recent years, definitely we have these very happy, cheerful, everybody's happy, everyone's great images of diversity. But disability is often seen as something that needs to be controlled and kept at bay in order to keep these happy narratives going.
Yeah, yeah, I agree with you completely. And if I had a pound for every person who's come up with that kind of, you can fix yourself to, not just pharmaceutical companies, but it leaks into everybody's attitudes, doesn't it? It's like, try vitamin B12. It's like, it's just a question of management. Take control of your body. So yeah,
Yeah,
and I'm sure that applies to many disabled people,
yeah.
not just people with MS. Go on, sorry, Ella.
No, definitely. And sorry, when you said take control of your body, that ignited a thought, but I think that really fits in with the aim of advertising, the very capitalist agenda, because taking control is often equated with buying something, whether it's buying makeup or whether it's buying drug therapy. And of course, I mean, to add insult to injury, these pharmaceutical advertisements produced in America, make it seem as though drug therapy is can just change somebody's life so easily. We know that these therapies can be incredibly expensive, not available to, lots and lots of people. So again, it's a very selective, misleading image of success.
Yeah. Well, one thing I'd like to add, if it's all right, is I often reminds me just advertise like the MS Society advertising and the actual reality of what the MS Society do, some of what the MS Society do for disabled people, for people with MS, is very, very different. So it often reminds me of when you see a trailer for a film, like the Beetlejuice trailer, makes it look really tacky, and you think, I'm not going to see that. And you go, and most people have gone to see it and say, oh, it was actually surprisingly good. And I had the same, even though, the question of charity is a hugely problematic one. It's like this kind of awful message that the MS Society are giving out, and the difference between the welfare services that they provide couldn't be more different. So I think there's a huge gap there between the way things are advertised and what we actually get from them, and not always positive either. I wondered if you could finish this with some kind of with some kind of look to the future in terms of what advertising could be doing better, and where disabled people fit within that. I get your message loud and clear that actually they've achieved quite a lot in a very short time, not least in actually getting more disabled women in advertising, which we know has been a problem throughout the representation of disabled people. But yeah, what could they do even better, and what should they avoid in the future? So that's kind of my final question, unless you want to say something about your future work as well.
Mm, Thanks, Alison. I would say in terms of what advertisers can do better, I'd say a really simple point is try to avoid cliches. I think that advertising can be replete with cliches. And I understand, a lot of people think that advertising is, base culture and, well, it's designed to appeal to the masses, so it can be a bit mindless. But actually, advertisers have got an incredibly hard job. It's very difficult to make advertisements that will appeal to masses of people. Actually, that's really hard, complex work. And so maybe then that gives rise to cliches that will appear and tug on the heartstrings of lots of people. But I think avoid cliches about disability because they are incredibly patronising and they will alienate and put a lot of disabled consumers off. I think one of the key ways that you can avoid cliches is by actually listening and being led and steered by, disabled people's opinions and voices, the disabled people's movement. I think as well, a key thing about advertising is that it needs to at least give the impression of being authentic. The authenticity factor is really important. So to be more aligned with disability activism, type of things that disabled people are, asking for would really help with authenticity. Another thing I think that, advertising really needs to think about accessibility. So I think if we truly are thinking about representation in an in-depth and informed way, images of disabled people, won't cut it. You really need to think about making advertisements truly engaging for disabled people and disabled audiences. And another point I'd raise relates to the hierarchy. I think it's really insulting and runs the risk of pushing many disabled people even further into the margins. If you only have, disabled people who are very visibly disabled, or say, for example, you tend to find in advertising, people who perhaps use prosthetic limbs or mobility aids or sensory aids that can almost be styled as fashion accessories. Actually, that is a very selective, superficial representation of disability. So to challenge the hierarchy would be really important. I think moving forward, in terms of how I would like my work to develop, I would definitely like to, I really enjoy working with disabled participants, disabled audiences. And I'm fascinated by the different types of responses to advertisements. So I think the logical next step for me really would be to think about different types of advertising. I tend to think quite a bit about charity advertising, obviously because it's played such a problematic role in attitudes towards disabled people over the years. Pharmaceutical advertising, I've also thought about. A chapter in the book focuses on controversial representations of disability in adverts. So comedic representations or representations that are quite risky. And so I think that's something I'd like to think more about. I think for now, though, I'm still enjoying the relief of having the book out there. It was very nice to finally hold a copy of it in my hands.
Yeah, can't wait to read it fully. It sounds absolutely fascinating. And I was going to say I was looking forward to this and that, but I'm looking forward to it all now. So yeah, thank you so much. I actually really, really want to talk to you about loads more things outside of this now. So maybe we can do that soon. But thank you very much, Ella, for being
Thank you
here
so
today.
much, Alison. Thank
All
you.
right. All right, thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening. We do hope you've enjoyed this episode of Disability And. Further episodes of Disability And can be found on the Disability Arts online website at www.disabilityarts.online.